Tonight, instead of Scott beating a gun to death with a hammer, we've got a special guest. This special guest is I'm told that I need to call her Emmy Betz, Associate Professor of Emergency Medicine from the University of Colorado. I had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Betz, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, as part of her research study around the safe storage of firearms. And Dr. Betz also comes to us from a member from California, Efren Moreno, who suggested that we get together and have a chat to talk about things like root cause mitigation and preventing firearms injuries. So tonight, we're going to have a presentation on dementia and firearms ownership. And I'm just going to get the hell out of the way as soon as I get the rest of the stuff out of the way so that Dr. Betz can talk. If you have questions, drop them in the Zoom channel. If you're following us on Facebook, Twitter, or Twitch, did I get them all? Or YouTube, rather, then ask questions there. We'll try to get to them. We'll make sure they get added into the questions. I believe Dr. Betz is going to take questions at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, Dr. Betz, welcome and thank you for talking to us tonight.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. And yes, please do send in questions. As you will find, there are lots of unanswered questions in this field, and we're really excited to be working in it, but we welcome your thoughts, suggestions, and there are no dumb questions. So I am from the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Colorado. I'm a practicing ER doc. And then I also have an affiliation with the VA, with the geriatric corps there in Denver. Just by way of kind of introduction and background, I'm a clinician, but I also do research probably about half of my time. And the big picture for me is really thinking about how do we help prevent injuries? So keep people healthy, prevent injuries, but how do we do it in a way that's actually respectful of individuals' views and their lifestyles and whatever preferences they have. And so we have a big multidisciplinary team working together to think about things like communication and connection, helping people make informed decisions, and then certainly how those things might play out in healthcare settings, but also in the community. So I just want to be clear, I'm not here to talk about policy work. I am not a gun owner myself, but I am a Colorado native, have lots of friends and family who own guns for all kinds of reasons. And for the past probably decade or so, I've been working with various firearm organizations and instructors and so forth, and really value the ability for us to find ways to work together, even if we don't agree on everything. So I'm not here to talk about gun control. I'm not here to talk about taking away people's guns, et cetera, et cetera. But I always start with that just to really get it out of the room. So instead, what really drives the work that I do is thinking about how do I, as a clinician or as a family member, tackle these really difficult subjects around injuries, around people getting hurt. How do we make it easier to tackle those tough subjects, the sort of elephant in the room? And so a lot of my work has been about driving, and how do we talk to older adults about maybe when is it time to hang up the keys, and how do we balance safety and independence as people age? How do we help them make decisions for themselves so that they still have that kind of ownership over their lives? And so we've done some work showing, maybe not surprisingly, but importantly, that communication about driving and stopping driving it's emotionally charged, it's sensitive, and people want it to be linked to a particular context, a particular disease or impairment. They want time to think about it. They want to maintain the decisions. And they, if it's healthcare providers who are involved, they want it to be people they trust and know. So then that sort of, for many reasons, was a natural kind of segue into the realm of what to do about firearm access when someone has dementia. And how do we help older adults, caregivers, families tackle these decisions in ways that protect the health and safety of the individual and the community around them, while still respecting rights, independence, decision-making, and so forth. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. I have to say this, I do get federal funding for my research, and I have an appointment at the VA. Nothing I'm going to say today is the official view of any federal agency. so I can say what I want. No, not really, but these are my opinions, certainly from research that we've been doing. And here's what I'm hoping to cover. And then again, I really hope that people throw in questions or comments. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what do we know about firearm access and dementia and firearm injuries in the context of dementia. What are the risks that people face? I'm not a lawyer, although I'm married to one, but I'm not one myself. But I'm going to talk about some of the legal questions that caregivers have. And then I'm going to talk a bit about what we know from research thus far about what caregivers want, and hopefully give you some sort of practical frameworks about how to think about these issues. So to start with some numbers. So this is an old slide, and I really need to update it, especially after the 2020 sales. This is an important slide for when I'm talking to groups who are more dementia focused than firearm focused, but there are a lot of firearms out there. I think we all know that. And a lot of older adults live in homes with guns and are aging, and it comes up sort of what to do about access if they no longer are safe to handle them. I think also probably not surprising to this group at all. In the United States now, the #1 reason for owning a firearm is for self-protection, followed by hunting and other reasons. And this matters because certainly as people age, they still have potentially safety concerns at home, and or they may have fewer safety concerns for some other reason, but for example, they may still want to be engaged in hunting or other kind of sport shooting. And obviously, all of these factors play into how someone decides to store firearms at home. So again, this slide is important, especially when I'm talking to people outside of the gun world, so to dementia providers, other healthcare providers, and sort of thinking about the reasons that older adults might have guns in their home. And so what do we know about the household prevalence among older adults of firearms? Based on some surveys that are out there, it's estimated that about 1/3 of older adults, and apologies to anybody who is 65 and doesn't feel older. I'm using that term because that is the standard kind of cutoff that is often used in research. I fully recognize age is a number, but anyways. When we look at adults in the US age 65 and older, about 1/3 own a gun themselves, and then about another 12% don't own a gun, but live in a home with a gun owner. And then a little over half don't. This is from other data. Now this is age 55 and up. Again, any gun, at least one gun stored in or around the home. Not surprisingly, there's geographic variation. And certainly within states, there's going to be variation in terms of the proportion of homes, urban versus rural and so forth. I again use this slide when I'm talking with especially healthcare providers to point out that for many states, you should just assume that there are firearms in the home. And it is something important to talk about in the correct way, because it's something that will come up as a safety concern at some point if someone has dementia. Okay, so what do we know actually about patients or older adults with dementia and firearm access? I admit this is where it gets a little tricky. So this is one study that was looking at, so these are community dwelling people, so not in nursing homes or other facilities that might have rules. They actually found 60% lived in a home with a gun. You know, this was one small study, so I'm not sure that I believe that the prevalence, that the number of people with guns in their home is actually higher among people with dementia. That doesn't really make sense to me. But I certainly don't think it's necessarily significantly lower than what we see in the general population. But if you want to do some math, I already did this math, so I can just show it to you. But if you want to do math based on, you know, what's going to happen with the population of dementia, it's going to become a bigger issue. And I should point out here, just pause for a moment to clarify when I'm talking about dementia, that's a broad umbrella. It includes Alzheimer's, but it also includes other forms of dementia caused by other metabolic issues or intrinsic kind of brain problems. Dementia can have a variable course in terms of how long it takes for someone to decline, but generally it is marked by a course of persistent decline. people sometimes say, isn't it the same if someone has like a significant brain injury? And I think some of what we're going to talk about today, yes, could be applied to someone who has brain injury or other kinds of sort of cognitive impairment, with the difference being that sometimes those improve over time, whereas dementia typically persistently gets worse. People might have kind of up and down days, but the prognosis is that they will have continued worsening of their overall functioning, which is why I think it really makes sense then to be thinking about kind of the next steps of their life in terms of driving and where they live and other kinds of potential health concerns or safety concerns. So when I talk about dementia today, I am including Alzheimer's, but I'm including kind of that whole umbrella of other forms of dementia and cognitive impairment. We know that those numbers are growing, that, with the aging of the population, there's sort of this explosion of people, the number of people with cognitive impairment in the United States and around the world. And so these issues are gaining in importance because there are actually just more people currently living now with cognitive impairment. Okay, so what do we know about, again, going back to sort of thinking about what do we know in terms of people with dementia who live in the community, so not in nursing homes, and access to firearms at home. This was from a survey that we did that we published earlier this year, and this was of caregivers who were themselves firearm owners, but they were also caregivers of someone with dementia. And lots of numbers, I'm gonna highlight a couple things for you. So the first is that among these caregivers who lived with the person with dementia, 31% said that that person with dementia was still able to access the firearms in the home, which I think is an area for engagement, that sometimes the guns don't actually belong to the person with dementia, they belong to the caregiver. And so incorporating this as part of safety counseling can be really important. And then you can see some differences here. The people who live together said about 30% said that the person with dementia themselves owned a firearm, much smaller where they didn't live with the person with dementia. We didn't clarify if this was because the person with dementia now lived in a facility or if they were community dwelling. And it may be that some caregivers don't actually know what mom or dad has. So I've been kind of dancing around this. Let's get to it. What are the actual risks that come with access to firearms in the context of someone having dementia or cognitive impairment? So we tried to estimate this in a publication from last year, kind of looking overall at violence and deaths in older adults. So this was older adults broadly, not just people with dementia, but it gives you a sense. And this graph I'm going to show on the left in the red, those are homicides, so somebody killing someone else. And the blue on the right is suicides, or someone killing themselves. And you can see then it starts at the youngest age and then goes up to 85 and up. This is using 10 years of data from the United States. And what you can see is, so the bars that are longer are higher rates. And so what you can see in the older age groups is that the vast majority of violent deaths are suicide. Suicide is the biggest risk factor for a firearm death. Suicide is the biggest cause of firearm death in older adults. I think that probably doesn't surprise anybody here, but it's true in the context of dementia too. And so when we think about, we certainly are concerned about the potential for unintentional injury to others, but really suicide is probably the number one cause of firearm-related death in people with dementia. So what do we know about suicide in dementia? Well, I just sort of alluded to this. When you look at all deaths in older adults that are from a firearm, 91% are suicides. And we know that among people with dementia, and generally among older adults, that firearms are the most common method used for suicide. But you can see in this one study, people with dementia who died by suicide, 73% of them used a firearm to do it versus 50% in all ages. And importantly, dementia itself may be a risk factor for suicide, especially diagnosis or the time period when someone feels like their deficits are worsening, that it may be it may be a high risk period when family want to be looking out for the person. In later stages of dementia, typically the person doesn't have the capacity anymore to really to plan or carry out a potentially more complex act like suicide. I think, though, homicide and risk to and harm to others is certainly what many people are concerned about, including home healthcare workers, the physical therapist who's stopping by, the visiting nurse. Dementia very commonly involves hallucinations, delusions, aggressions, agitation, particularly in the evenings. You may have heard of the concept of sundowning, where especially at nighttime, someone can become even more confused over their kind of baseline confusion. These symptoms are variable, and so some people develop lots of them, some really don't. And so it depends. You can imagine if there's somebody who's dealing with a lot of paranoia or delusions, that might be a bigger risk. If they, no longer recognize the people around them, and they're fearful of, say, people breaking into the house, when the visiting nurse comes, that may be a bigger risk than another person who's not experiencing those symptoms. So we'll come back to this later. A lot of kind of how we think about addressing this issue really has to do with understanding the particular symptoms that somebody is displaying. And I will just say there are not great numbers. We don't really know how often someone is threatened with a firearm in the context of dementia, but not shot, because those numbers just aren't really collected. And then unintentional, which I think this is also where it's hard to know, if it's aggression and paranoia, but in the context of confusion, is that intentional or unintentional? And I will just say there's a big overlap. But certainly this is a worry that someone could harm themselves or could harm someone around them. Because of both the impaired memory, but also judgment is impaired in dementia. There's a wonderful story that PBS NewsHour did, I think 2 years ago now. I put the link on the bottom if people are interested in watching it. But they talked to a family where the husband was a retired sheriff and still lived with his wife. He had Alzheimer's, or I think it was Alzheimer's. And she had locked up all the guns, but he was used to handling them every day. So he kept asking if he could look at one. He seemed better one day. So she got out one. She thought she checked to make sure it was unloaded. You know where this is going. She gave it to him. And then he shot her without actually even realizing that he had done it. So he shoots her in the stomach. She calls 911. She survives. He never realized what happened. And it's a pretty remarkable story. And she talks about how hard it was for her in that situation, that she wanted to make him happy to kind of do the things he was used to doing. But that was a case where, she maybe wasn't knowledgeable enough to fully make sure that the weapon was safe for him to be handling. Okay. So I want to talk briefly about some laws and logistics, because this comes up a bunch with caregivers wondering, what they can legally do. And again, I'm not an attorney. I talk to lots of people about these things. And so over the years, I've developed an understanding of what's out there, and we've written about it, but I'm not an attorney. So I'll just say that. So I'm going to skip that slide. So I will just say, though, actually, it's important. So, this does come up. Healthcare providers currently are allowed to talk with patients about firearm safety. And one of the things I do as a healthcare provider is really advocate for that kind of counseling to happen when it's appropriate and in a way that's appropriate, so that we can be helping patients make decisions that are right for them and their families. Okay, so state laws related to dementia. There are actually only 2 states that mention dementia in any laws related to firearms, Texas and Hawaii. Hawaii has this weird language about prohibiting firearm possession in the case of an organic brain syndrome without explicitly mentioning dementia. There's nothing related to severity or risk, and it's really unclear if or when that law is being applied. And then Texas says that people with chronic dementia are ineligible for a license to carry a handgun, but they may still purchase or possess. None of the other states, as of at least 2 years ago, had any specific mention of dementia in terms of firearm legislation. So this comes up then sometimes the federal background check, the language around mental defective. This varies state to state. Generally it has to be a court judgment that someone is a mental defective, which is just horrible language. Dementia could probably fit under here, but again, these are usually forms that are filled out at the point of purchase, as opposed to, obviously there's no system for renewal of registration and so forth. So a person with dementia potentially could not buy a new gun, but then it also is a question if they would be able to even fill out the form. So I would just say that currently there are not really any laws on the books that explicitly deal with the issue of firearm access in the context, especially of advanced dementia, which I think is potentially okay. I mean, I think that this is, again, where family usually steps in to kind of figure things out on their own. I do think that we need some additional policy clarification around caregiver rights, for example, and when can you transfer firearms and so forth. But I'm certainly not trying to advocate for some broad system of confiscation. I will just mention extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws, highly controversial, obviously. They have been mentioned in some states as a potential option for caregivers of people with dementia. Again, I see this as the very last option, that if someone really was at their wit's end and couldn't find another solution, potentially they could go down this route. This is as of August, I think. These are the states that currently have red flag laws. So obviously variable, and they vary a bit in terms of how they are set up. If you're curious to learn more, I will say that California has a website set up about sort of how to get one. And interestingly, they actually have one that they actually have some language specific to kind of dementia or suicide risk in older adults. So I'm going to come a little bit later to talk a little bit more about caregivers and questions around transfers. But generally speaking, there are not laws on the books that would prevent a person with dementia, especially with early cognitive impairment, from purchasing a new weapon or certainly being, required to turn anything in. Okay. So now what I want to do is move into this area of kind of what we're hearing from caregivers around what they need. And it's really hard, I think, and this is, I'm going to ask later for your help on this, because this is a subject that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. For the vast majority of the population, it probably doesn't really matter much. But for families who are dealing with this, I think it can be really emotionally difficult. And my goal and my team's goal is to help keep people healthy and safe and independent and respect older adults, and try to help caregivers to kind of ease the emotional burden from these kinds of situations. Family situations are very different. And so we'll come back to that in terms of how people might address this. I will put in a plug to say we are currently recruiting for focus groups. If you go to this QR code, it'll take you to our website. It explains a little bit. Basically, we're looking for older adults, especially veterans, and we're looking for family members of older adults to take part in focus groups about these kinds of topics. So if you're interested at all, please think about sending us an email, and you can always say no after you contact us. Okay, so what do we know? What are caregivers doing right now? What do caregivers need? So this is from that same survey I mentioned. It was a national survey of a sample of people. And we asked, have you ever had concerns about the person you care for with dementia having firearm access? And about 11% said that they had. And among those, about half had done something. I'm not really surprised that the 11% that number isn't higher, because I think often it maybe they've already taken care of the access. They've already kind of decided what they're doing. I think the 53% feels low. I would hope that if there were concerns, they would do something even if that was just initiating a conversation. We then asked, well, does the person with dementia, as far as the caregiver knows, do they have some plan themselves? That would be ideal, right? If people kind of thought ahead what they want to happen when they're no longer capable of safely operating them. And we found maybe about half had some kind of plan, written or not, which is, I think, better than I expected. But still, I think it has some opportunities for improvement there. And then we asked, well, should healthcare professionals talk about firearm safety with caregivers in the context of dementia? And most of the caregivers surveyed said yes. And again, this is in a very particular context that healthcare providers would be talking about it. And yet, only 5% had ever had those kinds of conversations. So on my end, on the healthcare provider end, I think we have a ways to go. So then we also asked, what do you think is most likely for a person with Alzheimer's? And you may remember from before, I already told you that suicide is by far the leading cause of firearm death in older adults. But what you can see here, those dark bars, people thought the most likely thing that would happen would be that the person would accidentally harm themselves, followed by harming themselves on purpose. And this to me really, as I kind of put the star there, that is in fact the most common thing in real life. And so this really to me highlights a knowledge gap where we need to do a better job educating caregivers on the various risks, including the risk of suicide when someone has Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. And then we asked them, because we're really interested, okay, well, where do you want to get your information from? And the take home here, generally, I think, is it varies. Some people, lots of people want family or friends to weigh in, which totally makes sense. Decent proportions, we're going to look toward dementia organizations. I would say, it looks like fewer would look to firearm organizations, but still up to 40% really wanted that kind of messaging. And so what this tells me is that we need to be thinking about how to get these messages out broadly through multiple avenues so that people can get information from the sources that they trust most. And so what is it that I want to get out? What are the actual recommendations? I want to try to walk you through one stepwise approach in thinking about kind of when is it time to do something, and or what is the thing you should do. So the first kind of stage, the pre-dementia stage almost, is what's called mild cognitive impairment. Typically, this is mild memory loss with objective cognitive deficits on testing. I mean, I think all of us have some memory loss, especially after 2020. But this is where there's actual formal testing that a clinician can do to identify that there are some deficits there. And the activities of daily living, or ADL, are still intact. So people can do all their toileting themselves, they can do cooking, they can go shopping. It might be a little harder than it used to be, but they still can manage kind of their daily life on their own. The next stage would be then mild dementia. And again, I'm not putting years or months on here because the time course is very different for different people. Mild dementia, typically now you've got moderate memory loss that interferes with at least one activity of daily living. So that might be, somebody's cooking and they forget what they were doing, driving and they forget where they're going, have trouble doing their other kind of basic activities. And this is, I think, a really important piece, that patients are aware of some of those deficits, but they don't have full insight. So you can no longer just trust, well, gosh, dad will know if he forgot where he was going when he was driving, maybe he shouldn't drive much anymore. Like they may not actually have the insight into their own level of ability. And then in mild dementia, people can start to develop some behavioral symptoms like hostility, sometimes delusions or paranoia. And then the next stage, moderate to severe, this is typically where people have really severe memory loss that interferes with daily functioning. They may not recognize friends and family anymore. They usually have behavior or personality changes. And I think at this stage is usually, when people are requiring near constant care, maybe in a facility, or have home health care, like a nursing aide. Okay, so if we think about this kind of trajectory, then we can think about, well, where does firearm access kind of fit in on this? So when we talk to clinicians, what we recommend is for mild cognitive impairment, there should be some questioning about, whether they have access to firearms at home, how things are stored. The judgment, insight, personality changes, because if they're having less judgment, if they're having personality changes, somebody who's already very hostile or paranoid, that might raise your concern that they may no longer be safe. Or certainly depressive symptoms could raise symptoms of depression that would raise concern about suicide. And then, so what do? So, certainly testing and referral for treatment of the cognitive impairment. So making sure somebody gets an accurate diagnosis and any treatment that might help. I put a question mark here because there's been some discussion about sort of assessment by a firearm specialist. And I think the challenge here is that somebody might do fine on a day in the range, but does that mean that at 2 a.m. they would make the right decision? And so I think this is where it also comes in, sort of what is the reason for using firearms? Is it that they want to, keep going to the range with their kids with their adult kids on the weekends, or go hunting, once a year? Or is it that they have a firearm, a handgun at home for protection? And so the sort of taking dad to the gun club to see how he's doing might make sense in some situations, but isn't necessarily something you can rely on because of the judgment piece. But I think importantly, in mild cognitive impairment, that's where I would hope that people would be starting to think about future changes. Who do you want to leave your guns to when you ultimately pass away? But hey, do you want to give it to your grandson? Maybe this Christmas would be a time to give it to your grandson, depending on his age and the laws, et cetera. But right. Or who's someone who you trust to take care of them, the property that maybe you've invested lots of money and time in, what do you want to happen to them? You tell us when the time comes that you are no longer safe. What do you want us to do? That kind of thing. So mild dementia, it's the same kind of questions. But I think here now it really becomes probably should only have supervised access, if that, depending again on the severity of the symptoms and the reason for use. And then by moderate to severe dementia, really should not have access to firearms. This is really when people are pretty impaired already. And so I think this becomes, I think, fairly understandable or common sense. And then, certainly for clinicians, we recommend that they consider that the person might be at immediate risk of, say, suicide if they've got significant behavior, depressive or personality issues going on. I think an important point that this was brought up by one of the social workers who I work with is in thinking about this with caregivers. It's really important to point out that this is not about the person. It's the disease that is causing the problem. In the same way that when someone drinks alcohol and is too impaired to drive home, it's not that that person isn't usually a good driver. It's not that that person is a bad person, but they're not safe to be behind a car or be behind the wheel, at that moment. And in the same way, unfortunately, dementia usually permanently changes the way a person thinks and their insight and their judgment and their ability to do things that previously they could do. And so, helping families understand that even though dad was always the protector, or, mom was the protector, or mom, a veteran with years of experience, whatever the case may be, the dementia changes that. And so putting that emphasis on that it is this disease that has changed the person, I think can be helpful for some caregivers in recognizing, your dad would never want to hurt you, but right now his brain is not functioning the way it used to. One of the tools we've come up with guidance from caregivers has been kind of a advanced firearm directive as a conversation starter, again, to kind of think about help somebody think about, who do I trust to make this decision? This is something that people have used for driving in the past. It's not a contract, it's not legally binding, but the idea is that maybe it would prompt a discussion, and that for some people it might help them kind of plan ahead. Most recently, we've been developing a tool. You can get to it at safetyanddementia.org or at this QR code. It's free for use. Feel free to spread it, use it, etc. It really was developed for caregivers to think through issues around home safety. So driving, general home safety, like kitchen hazards, as well as then the firearms piece that we've been talking about today. And what it does is it helps people think through some of their specific options. So, at-home storage, I don't need to tell you all, there are lots of different ways to store guns at home. And the solutions are going to vary. The right solution depends on the family, obviously. For somebody with dementia, the key is just that they should not have access. They shouldn't know the PIN. They shouldn't have the key. Disassembly is another thing that people talk about, or disabling a gun. Might help with some of the anxiety if it's someone who's used to handling or cleaning their weapons frequently. Disabling it might be an approach to kind of reduce the anxiety and also still reduce the risk of injury. People sometimes bring up, well, then if you had an issue and you called the police and they came and the person had the gun, then it could turn into a thing. Sure. I think this is where it's about a family making the decision that is right for them, and what is going to work on a daily basis to keep the peace in the home and keep things safe. And they may decide, for whatever reason, yeah, you know what, we are worried about what would happen if the police came, and so they move them out of the home and so forth. But it is one option that people talk about. Okay, so then we also talk about out-of-home firearm storage. In the context of suicide risk, we certainly talk about temporary storage, temporary transfers, while someone's going through a rough patch. Caregivers may choose to do out-of-home temporary storage while they figure out longer options, or obviously they may make some permanent changes. Options for out-of-home, so moving firearms out of the home, can include family members. So this is where, it might be either temporary or permanent transfer. Obviously depends on your state laws in terms of what is involved with that. And then some gun shops, ranges, law enforcement, pawn shops offer storage. As Ed mentioned, we met through a project I'm doing right now looking at community-based storage, voluntary temporary firearm storage. And what we found in a survey a few years ago is that in the Mountain West, about 3/4 of law enforcement agencies do offer storage, and about half of gun shops and ranges. And there are, lots of issues around liability and space and cost and so forth. But this is, if a caregiver is really trying to figure out what to do and just wants to move the guns out of the home temporarily, that is an option. The question has come up is, what would happen if a person, say, takes in mom's firearms to store, and mom has dementia? It depends on the shop, certainly, in terms of whether they ask who the owner is or not. It might depend on the state as well in terms of what the regulations are. My understanding is that, many stores will resell guns, and they may, have a brief waiting period to make sure that the gun is not registered as stolen. But a legal power of attorney would certainly satisfy any concerns a caregiver might have. But the sense I get from talking to lots of shops as well as law enforcement is that often they wouldn't ask to see that power of attorney, which is maybe an issue in terms of property. And could your kids steal your property? I suppose that could be an issue. But when I talk to caregivers, I basically tell them that, they can be, honest with law enforcement agencies and gun ranges and retailers, but also can go store things and not necessarily have to show any proof of ownership. So again, I hope that this tool people might find helpful. We would welcome any feedback. We are doing some edits on it right now. And what it tries to do is really walk people through considerations for how they might want to store things at home, kind of what, who else is in the home, how concerned are they about safety or protection, and then think about their options. As a brief recap, and then I'm really excited to hear feedback and answer questions. So, we know the numbers of people with dementia are growing, and we know many of them have firearms at home. The laws certainly allow discussions with healthcare providers. Transfers, as I think we all know, and I didn't even go into this that much, are complicated in terms of background checks and getting things back. For caregivers, probably at least for temporary transfers or storage elsewhere, it might be easier. And then I think caregivers really need help here. I think this is where we are hoping to be able to help with development of education and resources that people can use. There are lots of unanswered questions. So I will put in the plug again that we would love for you to be involved or invite your friends or your friends, your parents, et cetera, for focus groups with older adults and family members of older adults, because there's lots we don't know about how to address these issues and help people make decisions that are right for their families and hopefully keep everyone healthy and safe. I'd welcome any emails as well. If you have questions or comments, you can feel free to contact me directly. And with that, I'm going to stop. And I think there's some moderators who are maybe going to help with the questions. They told me not to look at the chat box.
That's correct. We have a bunch of questions all set up here for you.
All righty.
First question is going to be about that last slide, actually. The QR code didn't work on my phone.
Oh, no.
I know a few people had asked for the link. So if you could provide that, I could pass it around.
I sure will. You know what? I can even do it right now because I'm an ER doctor and I can multitask. And so I will put it up in the chat box. Sorry about that, everybody.
Oh, not a problem. And it could just be my phone.
Probably, but you can blame it on me. That's okay.
I work in IT. I'm used to taking the blame.
Okay. Okay. I just saw one of the last comments. Walk the Talk America. I'm huge fans of them. Yes, it's wonderful stuff they're doing. So I answered that question. Okay.
I see the link. I will throw it in our other chat program as well. First question, besides that, this is with regards to the number of firearms in homes of those who have dementia. There's actually two questions. Would the feeling of I need to own a firearm for self-defense become stronger due to dementia? Could that be a causal factor?
Causal in terms of purchasing a firearm?
Well, you said that you thought it was strange that the percentage of fire. I mean, could that be a reason why that would be higher?
It could be. I think it may have also had something to do with that particular clinic. I mean, I think so. If we think about like veterans with dementia, for example, the number of people who have firearms might be higher too. I don't know, for example, older adults who are first-time firearm purchasers, because it's sort of in the context of developing paranoia. I don't think that's a big issue. My understanding is most of the people who are older gun owners purchased their first weapon many, many years ago. So, but it's an interesting question. And I think it's an area where we just don't really know. So I tend to think basically that the numbers are probably similar to the general population.
Gotcha. With regards to that, is it possible that, I'll just read this out. Do you think that the number of people with dementia who have a gun in the home are perhaps just more accurately reported due to the circumstances of the situation rather than the study itself being incorrect?
I mean, that also could be like all of our estimates of firearm prevalence in homes are based on surveys. And so are we surveying accurately in terms of who we're calling or people answering the questions versus in a clinical setting where people are being asked more specifically? I don't know. It's a good question.
So with regards to caregivers and healthcare, are there any programs or guides or resources that people can access about how to communicate with family members when these issues come up?
Yes, absolutely. I will put that in the chat as well. One of the places I send people to is the Bullet Points Project, which is being developed for California providers, but I think has some good basics. It's not just in the context of dementia, but that is one of the circumstances they talk about.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
With the stigma associated with non-firearm groups utilizing the term gun safety, does the Colorado Firearm Safety Coalition support legislation or laws that show they are not for an assault weapons ban, or any of those other types of legislations or laws that would immediately get that knee-jerk reaction from those who see gun safety and just go, nope, and exit the conversation?
Okay, I'm going to scroll up so I can see the question. I will say generally, and I forgot to say,
it's not there.
Oh, okay. I forgot to say, so yes, I co-founded the Colorado Firearm Safety Coalition years ago. We are a coalition of individuals as opposed to organizations. And we don't do lobbying. We don't do policy work. We don't take official stands on any policies really, because we really want to be about working together to develop educational approaches, especially around suicide prevention. So in that sense, we wouldn't have a specific stance on any kind of law, I guess. I do think the way we talk about firearms is really important, and that these, all of the words that trigger us, no pun intended, I guess. How can we learn to communicate better so that we're not immediately turning each other off? I think is really important. Did that answer the question?
It did.
Yeah.
Yes.
So one of our board members wanted me to convey that the club has been working on some Make It Safe videos where we demonstrate how to check to see if a gun is loaded, if it is encountered in any situation. And it's something that I personally share with my friends who are social workers and work in foster care, because a lot of times they have to go in and, get a child from a house and deal with angry parents and things like that. So on that same topic, is there a need for a program that would provide like in-home healthcare providers with some basic firearm safety training so that they're able to handle that as well?
That is such a great question. I don't know of anything specific out there, but it really just makes me think about the need to make sure that other household members know at least the basics. I mean, when we talk to, say, caregivers, generally we say, look, if you don't know how to handle the gun, don't. Like, call someone you trust or call the police. Like, don't touch it. But hey, the question is, how do you proactively train people? And I don't know of any programs out there, but I think it's great you guys are developing. And
this is like all of a sudden like my new dream job. So maybe I'll just have to like make a startup or something and travel around the country and train people on how to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it does come up, I will say, in the ER as well. Usually security checks people, but the general training for us is like, if you don't know how to do with it, like put the trash can over it and sit on it. But like, it's something that I think many people have never done. And, I've even had training and I'm not sure I totally would trust myself still. So it's hard because if you don't keep doing it, you can lose so it's great. That's a great new company for you to start.
Awesome. And until then, the Liberal Gun Club has the Make It Safe videos on YouTube. With 90% of deaths involving a gun being suicide, you mentioned in the third stage, usually they're too far gone to do that, commit suicide. Is earlier intervention even more important in that case?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think, and I don't have a chart of this, but when we think about suicide in the context of dementia, I think it's going to be earlier in the disease. I think sometimes that period right after diagnosis can be traumatic for people. I will just put in a plug. The focus groups we're doing, part of it is trying to actually tackle this really tough subject of suicide in older adults and the issues around sort of dignity and desire to kind of have control over one's life. But from my perspective, suicide is also very traumatic for families. And so sort of this balancing of older adults' independence and will with kind of safety and so forth, that I do think suicide prevention is still important, while we're also paying attention to sort of options at the end of life. So yes, I think that's where the early intervention piece is even more important in thinking about, because this, this talk was about dementia, not about suicide prevention, but we know that sometimes, actually very often, suicide occurs with a relatively short period of deliberation. Like there may have been thoughts for a long time, or mental illness, depression, anxiety kind of creeping upward. But the decision to act can often be, as people sometimes call it, impulsive. And that's why we know that keeping firearms or other highly lethal methods away from someone at risk can save lives, because if they can't reach for a gun in that moment, even if they take pills, they're far more likely to survive. And so that's why we think about kind of locking up guns when someone is at risk of suicide. And so I think in older adults, especially that kind of early cognitive impairment, if someone is talking about death, showing other signs that they may be thinking about suicide, it's really important to intervene.
And then we had one in our YouTube stream, one of our members asked, have you ever heard of language regarding language directly related to firearms and or dementia included in a healthcare advance directive?
Oh, great question. Yes and no. So I don't think I've ever seen it explicitly as part of a healthcare advance directive. But I do know there are some like financial planners who, as part of their like financial planning and doing healthcare directives, talk about firearms as well. And that's my dream, is that we would think about your living situation, driving, firearms, kind of these other big emotional topics early, so that people really can lay out what their own wishes are. So I haven't seen it explicitly included in one, but in my mind, it really makes sense to have them kind of parallel process. That the person who's your healthcare power of attorney, maybe that's the person you trust to tell you when it's time to stop driving or to lock up the guns.
I hope that those of us who come from parents who were firearms owner have had that discussion with our parents already, but it might definitely be a new topic for people in the younger generations that don't own firearms and are caring for parents that have been lifelong owners of them. So yeah. It's a great one. Kyle, do you have another one?
I have several. Most of these revolve around a way to keep at least some semblance of a firearm around, whether that's having a dummy gun, something that is not functional, or taking perhaps an heirloom firearm and disabling it so it is no longer functional, or potentially using a dummy round. Do any of those options seem viable?
Yeah, I mean, this is like where, again, we are like so just scratching the surface. I love these ideas and would love to hear from people who have things that have worked for their family. I mean, you may have seen, right, this sort of dummy items have been used, like fake pets, fake babies in nursing, for people with more severe dementia sometimes, that they're really comforted by like a realistic but fake cat can like help kind of calm people. So it totally makes sense to me that could be something that families could try, especially if it's someone who's really agitated by not being able to get it, if it's something they were kind of handling on a daily basis. So I don't have any numbers on it, but I think they're great ideas.
Gotcha. I think we have this last one here, and we might be done. Are adults suffering from dementia and potentially contemplating suicide likely to hide guns from the family?
But potentially, I don't have good numbers on that because we don't. It's a hard area that has been understudied again. But yeah, I mean, I think that there are some older adults, whether it's a new dementia diagnosis or another terminal illness that they feel, or illness that they feel like is really robbing them of their dignity. At least some of them may not reveal plans, or, you know, they may have purchased new firearms and not told anybody about. So it's hard. And I think, can we prevent all of them? Maybe not. But I think this is where healthcare providers have a role, and especially around the time of diagnosis, and kind of talking to families and older adults about the risk of suicide. And I think the other thing I would say is, you know, we have, I think, still this, like, there's still, I think, stigma around aging and feeling like you are a burden on your family, right? And that people may feel like suicide is the way out to relieve their family, but in fact, families generally don't want that. And so how do we tackle, these are bigger issues that we're not going to fix tonight for sure, but I think that's where hopefully we can help families deal with these issues, whether it's aging with dementia or with cancer or other kinds of issues, and helping people understand kind of how they can get help, how it's okay to get help, whether that's like physical help or emotional help. Because I think suicide is, as someone who's lost people to suicide, like probably most people here have, it leaves really lasting scars on family who might not feel like they got to say goodbye, right? And all of these other kind of issues. So how do we balance dignity and independence with grief and healing for families, I think is a really challenging one. And to go back to the question, yes, I think there are definitely going to be people who hide things, and all the more reason that we try to give people the tools to talk about it, and hopefully make those conversations easier.
I do not have any additional questions at this point. So Ed or Danny?
It sounds like this is a big topic that isn't fully explored, and there's a lot of research and work that still needs to be done. So I hope that our viewers and the people who watch this later are willing to visit your websites and provide any help that they possibly could. And I understand that we as a club may be working with you some more in the future, and I look forward to that. So. And I hope we can help you along the way.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate the chance to talk to you all. I'm sorry I couldn't give you lots of black and white, but I think we need to hear from you all and figure this all out together. So please feel free to email me or check out, you can get a hold of me through the website. And I hope you might think about participating in our study or pass it along to people who are interested.
Well, definitely. You guys can hear me, right? Good.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Ed.
Looks like the microphone's working. It wasn't before. Dr. Betz, thank you so much for coming. And yes, I think there are some potential plans, maybe even some plans with your friends in Vermont, where we might be able to help do classes and whatnot for professionals who know anything about firearms, to maybe learn something about them, so that when they encounter them, they are better educated. But in the meantime, again, that YouTube channel is a good place to start. And if anybody in your circle needs help or has questions, they should feel free to reach out directly to us, me specifically, but any of the folks that you have contact for here to get that kind of help, because this is part of our mission, and our mission is education, and we're really big on that whole root cause and mitigation thing. So
that's great.
Dovetails right in. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And this was wonderful. I've had a relative suffer from Alzheimer's, and she died many years ago. Thankfully, there were no firearms involved, because I don't know what we would have done. It would have been a confusing and complicated situation, because the disease is awful and really, really strange for those people who don't have it. So it's amazing work that you're doing, and I thank you so much.
Thanks. I'm keeping you from your pub hour, though, so thank you.
No,
so
you're
much.
not.
No, I was just
no.
I was about to say, do you have any parting comments before I turn everybody loose into the pub?
Well, there are certain people in the chat that are saying thank you so much.
Yes.
So I don't know if you've seen that.
I did see
Ed,
that.
we might want to kill the live stream before Lonnie starts talking, though.
Yeah, I'll do that.
I'm not going to say anything inappropriate, guys. Give me a break.
Oh my goodness gracious me.
We love you, Lonnie.
I was going to say, Dr. Betz or Emmy, I recently did a physical with my primary care physician, and there was a questionnaire that was given. And one of the questions on it is, do you own firearms? Which I told them was none of their damn business. But it is interesting that is starting to find its way into, for those of us who are past that age of 65, it is interesting that it is finding its way. There's a little cognitive questionnaire that the aide will give you and ask you 30 or 40 seconds later to repeat it, things like that. But I find it very interesting that those are things that I had not experienced until I reached that age.
Well, and I will tell you, I just earlier today spent a long time discussing and arguing with people like how to phrase questions like that, and how do we bring these things up in a way that also respects some people aren't going to want to talk about it at all. And that's where I think it's so important to get this messaging out through other modalities besides healthcare providers too. But how do we ask screening questions that make sense, and when do we ask them? And we're grappling with it. So you lived it.
It's also interesting that I have recently started having this conversation with my wife about what happens to what I have in my safe if I get to the point where either I am incapable of making a rational decision, or if something physically happens to me that makes me incapacitated, what then happens to those things that I have in the safe. And fortunately, I have younger daughters who are own guns, so they will probably find their way to them. But I recently had my neighbor's husband had dementia and eventually moved to Alzheimer's and recently passed. And she actually brought me all of his guns that I kept in my safe until he passed. And then I instructed her how to legally transfer them to a new buyer.
So you should have given this talk.
No, not at all.
No, but it's really, I mean, these are the kinds of stories we hear, and this is how we build solutions. And I think how we share tips and tricks that have worked with others. So thank you for sharing that.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and kill the stream.
Thank you.
And thank you again. And we'll talk for a few minutes past after I click the stop button.